Welcome back to NTD Good Morning. I'm Carrie Dunst. Today, the kids are off school, and so are the politicians and the Wall Streeters. It's President's Day. And to discuss the significance of the day, we're happy to now be joined by Jeffrey Bloodworth. He's professor of modern American political history over at Gannon University. Jeffrey, thank you for joining us. Let's start with chatting about George Washington. When you teach your students, what do you want them to take away from the legacy of the leader of course, our military that fended off the British crown and also established the independent republic, as well as our first president?
Well, when I teach about Washington and the founders, virtue is the word that comes to mind. That generation, and especially Washington, what they very much prized is to have leaders who were virtuous, who were not self-interested. And so Washington was known, actually, for not saying much in meetings. He led by behavior. He led by actions. He led by example. For instance, at his death, George Washington freed or manumitted his slaves, which in the 21st century, we might think, well, he should have done that during his life. But that was an enormous example to Americans in the 1790s of kind of what the revolution meant, and that this was a revolution for human freedom. So virtue and not being self-interested, being interested in the commonweal is Washington's gift and example.
You know, you've just given a great example of how he applied his sort of philosophy and leadership principles. Are there any other examples that you think exemplify Washington trying to model the appropriate behavior to those around him, and how we might be able to apply some of those lessons today?
When Washington led the victorious Continental Army against the British, what he did is he went to the Continental Congress and resigned his commission as general, which in the history of the world, if you are the leader of a rebellious army and you defeat an empire, you then become king, monarch, emperor, whatever the title. But what Washington did is he resigned his commission and he went home to Mount Vernon. When King George III heard that, he said that Washington must be the most famous man in the world. And it is another example of what Washington was showing was virtue, is that you are entitled to leadership if you can demonstrate the virtue that you are not self-interested, that you're looking at the broader kind of commonweal for all Americans. And that act of resigning his commission and going home rather than seizing power it made George Washington this figure of historic world importance in the late 18th century.
Yeah, and certainly could have been our first king, and he was, of course, our first president. So there's so much inspiration there. But I do want to move forward 7 years later to our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. What's the essence of Lincoln? What do you impart to your students when you discuss Lincoln?
The extraordinary thing is Lincoln, his combined formal education was probably just a few months. Nevertheless, I mean, literature classes are taught just about Lincoln's writing. And so, Lincoln had this enormously difficult childhood. His mother died. He had a terrible relationship with his father. They were extremely poor. His life was filled with loss and grief. And the extraordinary thing about Lincoln is that, just the perseverance. And again, there's a reason why it's Washington and Lincoln that really are President's Day, is that Lincoln demonstrates the virtue and the promise of America, and that, Washington did come from at least the middle ranks of American society and married into the elite. Lincoln, you couldn't have been born more humble than Abraham Lincoln. And he, like Washington, they both become characters of world historical importance. This time in the late 19th century, decades after his death, Lincoln was extraordinarily famous. And, again, only in America. And you can start saying that about the rise of Americans from humble beginnings to elite ranks. Lincoln exemplifies this.
Yeah, it's so interesting to discuss the contrast between these two presidents. As you mentioned, while Washington was of sort of the middle class, he married into sort of the aristocracy of society. Lincoln, the opposite. I almost think that is such an American thing, right? To root for the underdog. We just saw with the quarterback of Seattle, Sam Darnold. He just had all these challenging seasons. People thought, he didn't have an opportunity to even play on a team, let alone lead a team and win the Super Bowl. It seems like a lot of that comes from Lincoln. Can you talk a little bit about all the adversity he faced in his political career before finally winning the election?
I think about Sam Darnold and his path, actually, and how he was forgotten and considered a washout. Then he won. I was rooting for the Seahawks because of that. Washington won one political contest before he became president. He was a one-term congressman, a Whig from Illinois.
We're talking about Lincoln, though, right? Not Washington.
Excuse me, Lincoln. Yes.
Yeah, that's all right.
Lincoln. When he ran for Senate against Stephen Douglas, and which made him a figure of national historical importance, he actually lost the Senate race to Stephen Douglas in Illinois in the 1850s. And so Lincoln, until he became president in 1861, you would have considered his political career to have been a failure because it was loss after loss after loss. And this Lincoln is just a study in that, America really is a place where people can rise, where you're never counted out, where, the last chapter, can be written and be glorious, when you're well into your middle ages. Lincoln, is the quintessential American political underdog who becomes, really a figure of world historical importance. And you cannot think of another American who was born to humbler circumstances, who struggled more with depression and loss and family members dying. He lost a son during his presidency, yet he persevered. And I think that's what we do on President's Day is we think about great leaders and their achievements, and I draw inspiration. If they can persevere through difficult times, so can I, and so can we all.
Yeah, you bring up so many interesting points of both of these iconic presidents. Lincoln's almost like a fashion icon. Like you could just see his silhouette and that's Lincoln. But as we start to finish up in our last 30 seconds, you mentioned Washington freeing his slaves. Of course, the Emancipation Proclamation, something that Lincoln oversaw and led to the Civil War and then the reunification. What can we learn from those examples to sort of take a look at this moment of polarization in our country and try to sort of come back to the middle?
Yeah, look, both men grew in adulthood and changed their views and helped define America as a nation of freedom. And so I always think of the example of Washington and Lincoln as, extending the hand across the partisan aisle of growing even into your adulthood intellectually. And, and helping America become, the America that was foreseen in the Declaration of Independence, a flawed nation, but, a nation founded upon ideals that we are still living out. And Washington and Lincoln, demonstrate, extraordinary partisan divides during their era. But these are two men who were able to reach across it and are beloved, across ideologies.
Jeffrey Bloodworth, happy President's Day. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.